The Interstellar Naval Academy floated in the darkness of space like a metal flower with 1,000 petals. And Cadet Kira Vance pressed her face against the observation window to watch the stars spin slowly past her reflection. She had been here for 3 months now, but the wonder had not faded, and she doubted it ever would, because Earth girls from the mining colonies of Nevada rarely got to see anything this beautiful. "Vance, stop daydreaming and get to formation," barked a voice behind her, and Kira turned to see Instructor Morath standing in the doorway with all 4 of his massive arms crossed over his chest. She nodded quickly and jogged past him, her boots echoing on the metal floor as she made her way to the training hall where the other cadets were already gathering in neat rows. Kira was one of only 12 humans at the academy, and she felt the difference every single day because the galaxy was vast and humanity was very small within it. A newcomer species that had only discovered faster than light travel 40 years ago. Most of the other species looked at humans with confusion or disgust, and Kira had learned to ignore the whispers that followed her through the corridors. The words like Deathworlder and primitive and dangerous animal that floated behind her like shadows. She took her place in the 3rd row and stood at attention, her eyes forward but her mind wandering across the faces of her fellow cadets. The Valorians stood at the front as always, their tall, elegant bodies and silver skin making them look like living statues. And they held themselves with the confidence of a species that had ruled 1,000 worlds for 10,000 years. Their leader was Tyrek Shao, the son of a Valorian noble, and even now he was smirking at something one of his friends had whispered, his sharp teeth glinting under the artificial lights. Kira did not like Tyrex, and she suspected that nobody really did except for those who wanted his family's power and wealth. Her eyes moved to the back of the formation where the smaller species gathered, the ones without political power or military tradition, the ones that the galaxy had decided were less important. That was where she spotted Reynold. He was a Phileth, a species that resembled what Earth people might call a deer if that deer was 3 feet tall and covered in soft, bioluminescent patches that glowed a gentle blue when he was calm. Right now, those patches were dim and flickering, and Kira could see the tension in his thin shoulders as he tried to make himself as small as possible. Reynold had been assigned to her training squad 2 weeks ago, and in that time, Kira had learned 3 things about him. First, he was brilliant, with a mind for xenobiology that made even the instructors pause and listen when he spoke. Second, he was kind, always offering to help other cadets with their studies, even when he was exhausted. Third, he was terrified, and that terror seemed to grow worse with every passing day. The training session was brutal as always, and Kira pushed through the combat drills with the grim determination that her planet had bred into her bones, because Earth did not raise quitters. She noticed that Reynold struggled with the physical exercises, his herbivore body not built for violence, but he never complained, and he never stopped trying. When the session ended, Kira grabbed her water container and walked toward him, offering a smile that she hoped looked friendly rather than frightening because humans apparently had too many teeth. "Good work today," she said, and Reynold flinched before he recognized her and forced his own nervous smile. "Thank you, Cadet Vance," he replied, his voice soft and musical in the way of his species. "I am trying my best to improve. Call me Kira," she said, "and you are improving." "I have seen it." His bioluminescence brightened slightly at the praise, and Kira felt a warmth in her chest at the sight. They walked together toward the mess hall, and Kira pretended not to notice the way. Reynold kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something terrible to emerge from the shadows. She wanted to ask him what was wrong, but she had learned that pushing too hard only made him retreat further into himself. So she talked about other things instead, about Earth and its blue skies and its dangerous wildlife that Reynold found both horrifying and fascinating. "Your world truly has creatures that hunt your species for food?" he asked, his large dark eyes wide with disbelief. "Many of them," Kira confirmed. "But we learned to hunt them back," Reynold shuddered. And Kira wondered what it must be like to come from a world without predators. A world where the greatest danger was a strong wind or a cold night. The Phileth homeworld was a paradise by galactic standards, gentle and warm and safe. And it had produced a gentle and warm and safe species that the rest of the galaxy seemed to view as easy targets. After dinner, Kira returned to her quarters and tried to study, but her mind kept drifting back to Reynold and the fear in his eyes. Something was wrong, and she intended to find out what it was. The answer came 3 days later when Kira was walking through a corridor near the maintenance section and heard voices echoing from around a corner. She recognized the cold, sharp tone of Tyrvik Shao immediately, and she pressed herself against the wall to listen. "Look at it glow," Tyrvik was saying, and laughter followed his words. "Like a little nightlight for children. Please," came another voice. And Kira felt her stomach drop because she knew that voice too. "I need to return to my quarters. You will leave when I say you can leave." "Pray." Kira moved around the corner, her footsteps deliberately loud. And the scene before her made her blood turn hot. Tyrvex and 4 of his Valorian friends had Reynold backed against a wall, and the small Phileth was trembling so hard that his bioluminescence was flickering like a dying flame. The Valorians turned at her approach, and Tyrvex smiled that sharp predator smile of his. "Move along, human," he said. "This does not concern you." Kira held his gaze for a long moment, and something in her expression made his smile falter just slightly. Then she looked at Reynold, silently asking if he wanted her help, but he shook his head rapidly and forced brightness into his voice. "It is fine, Kira. We were just talking." She did not believe him, but she could not force him to accept help he did not want. So she nodded slowly and walked away, feeling the Valorian's eyes on her back like needles. That night, she lay awake in her bunk and made a decision. She would watch, and she would wait, and when the time came, she would be ready. Because Earth had taught her many things, and one of those things was that predators only understood one language. And Kira Vance was fluent. Kira spent the next 2 weeks watching and learning, and what she discovered made her sick to her stomach. The hazing at the academy was not a secret, but it was also not something anyone wanted to discuss openly because the truth was ugly and complicated. The Valorian Dominion funded nearly a third of the academy's operations, and that money bought silence and blind eyes and careful forgetting. Tyrek Shao was not the first noble son to torment weaker cadets, and the instructors had long ago learned that interfering meant losing funding, losing positions, losing everything they had built. Kira tried the official channels first because she believed in systems and rules and the idea that someone in charge would care. She filed a report with the Academy's disciplinary office and waited 3 days for a response that never came. She requested a meeting with the commandant and was told he was unavailable for the next 6 months. She approached Instructor Morath after training one evening, and the grizzled Kethra veteran listened to her concerns with all 4 of his arms folded and his scarred face unreadable. "I know what you are asking," he said when she finished, his voice low and rough like grinding stones. "And I am telling you now to stop. But they are hurting him," Kira protested. "I have seen the marks on his arms, the way he flinches at shadows." "I know," Morath replied. And for a moment something like shame flickered across his alien features. "But the Dominion sons are untouchable here, and you are one small human with no powerful allies. So we just let it happen?" Kira demanded, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Morath leaned closer, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I am telling you to be smart, Vance. And there is a difference between giving up and choosing your battles." He walked away before she could respond, and Kira stood alone in the empty training hall, feeling the weight of the galaxy pressing down on her shoulders. That night, she found Reynold in the Academy library, surrounded by data tablets and holographic star charts as he studied xenobiology with the desperate focus of someone trying to forget everything else. She sat down across from him without asking permission, and he looked up with tired eyes that made her heart ache. "You do not have to keep checking on me," he said softly. "I know you mean well, but you will only make things worse for yourself. Tell me why you are here," Kira said, ignoring his words. "Tell me why you joined the military when your species has no tradition of violence." Reynold was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was barely audible. "My family are servants," he explained, "bonded workers for a Valorian trading house. And they have been servants for 6 generations, because that is how my species survives in this galaxy." He paused, and his bioluminescence dimmed with old pain. "If I complete my service at the Academy and earn my commission, my entire family gains citizenship rights, and my younger siblings will be free to choose their own paths. That is why you cannot drop out." Kira realized, and Reynold nodded slowly. "Tyrvex knows this," he admitted, "and he finds it amusing to see how far he can push me before I break. But I will not break. I cannot break, because too many people are depending on me." Kira reached across the table and placed her hand over his, and he flinched at the contact before slowly relaxing. "You are not alone," she told him, "and I am not going to let them destroy you. You cannot fight the entire Valorian Dominion," Reynold said with a sad smile. "Watch me," Kira replied, and something in her voice made his bioluminescence flicker with an emotion she could not name. The days continued, and Kira gathered information like a hunter tracking prey, because that was exactly what she was doing. She learned that Tyrvex had driven 2 cadets to drop out in the previous year, both of them prey species with no political protection. One of them had suffered a broken arm in what was officially recorded as a training accident. The other had simply disappeared one night and was found the next morning in a maintenance corridor, shaking and unresponsive, and the medical report called it stress-induced shock, but everyone knew the truth. She learned that Tyrvex was careful, always choosing victims who could not fight back and would not be believed if they reported him. She learned that he recorded his sessions, keeping the footage as trophies or perhaps as insurance, and that knowledge burned in her mind like a coal. She learned the layout of the station's lower levels, the maintenance corridors and forgotten cargo bays where the lights flickered and the security cameras had blind spots. These were the hunting grounds, and Kira memorized every entrance and exit. On the 15th day, Reynold did not appear for morning drills. Kira felt ice spread through her veins as she scanned the formation and found his usual spot empty. She raced to his quarters after training and found his bunk perfectly made, his belongings untouched, his data tablet still sitting on his desk. He had not packed. He had not left a message. He had simply vanished. Kira closed her eyes and forced herself to think clearly, because panic would not help anyone. On Earth, she had grown up in the mining colonies where everyone knew everyone and gossip traveled faster than light. And she had learned a few tricks for finding information that people wanted to hide. The Academy's activity logs were supposedly secure, but Kira had noticed that the maintenance hatches used an older system with weaker encryption. It took her 20 minutes to access the records, and what she found made her blood run cold. A maintenance hatch on sublevel 7 had been accessed at 3 in the morning, and the authorization code belonged to Tyrvex Shao. Kira stood up from her desk and took a deep breath, feeling something ancient and dangerous stirring in her chest. Earth had made humans into survivors, into adapters, into the most persistent predators their planet had ever produced. Other species might be stronger or faster or smarter, but humans had something else, something that their gentle galaxy had forgotten existed. Humans had rage. And as Kira made her way towards sublevel 7, she let that rage fill her like fire, burning away the doubt and the fear and the hesitation. She was not going to file a report. She was not going to request a meeting. She was going to do what humans had done for 100,000 years when something threatened their pack. She was going to hunt. The lower levels of the station were a maze of shadows and flickering lights, and Kira moved through them like a ghost. She had studied these corridors for 2 weeks, memorizing every turn and every hiding spot, and now that knowledge guided her feet through the darkness. The environmental systems down here were old and poorly maintained, and the air was thin and cold, the kind of conditions that would weaken most galactic species, but barely registered to a human. Earth was a world of extremes, of deserts and frozen wastes and mountains where the air was too thin to breathe, and humanity had evolved to survive them all. Kira's ancestors had chased prey across African savannas for hours under a burning sun, and their bodies had become engines of endurance that the galaxy could not match. She felt strong down here in the cold and the dark, and she let that strength fill her as she approached her destination. The cargo bay was ahead, marked by a faint glow leaking through a half-open door. Kira slowed her approach and pressed herself against the wall, listening to the voices that echoed from within. "Say it again," commanded a cold, sharp voice that she recognized as Tyrvex. "Say it properly this time, please," came the response. And Kira's heart broke at the sound because Reynold's voice was cracked and weak. Barely more than a whisper. "Please let me go." Laughter filled the cargo bay, and Kira counted 5 distinct voices joining Tyrvex's cruel amusement. "That was pathetic," Tyrvex sneered. "I want you to beg like you mean it, pray. And I want you to say that you know your place." Kira edged closer to the door and peered through the gap. And what she saw made her vision blur with fury. Reynold was on his knees in the center of the cargo bay, surrounded by 5 Valorian cadets who towered over him like silver monuments. His bioluminescence had faded to almost nothing, a sign of extreme distress in his species, and his body was trembling so hard that he could barely stay upright. There were marks on his arms and face, dark bruises that told the story of hours of torment. Tyrvex stood directly in front of him, holding a small recording device and wearing an expression of pure sadistic pleasure. "One more chance," he said sweetly. "Beg for mercy, and maybe I will consider stopping." Reynold raised his head, and Kira could see that his eyes were empty. The eyes of someone who had been broken and knew that more breaking was coming. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking on the word. "Mercy, I am begging you. Please show mercy." Tyrvex smiled and raised his hand, and Kira knew that he was going to strike despite the plea, because mercy was not something he had ever learned. She stepped through the door. Her footsteps echoed in the sudden silence, and all 5 Valorians turned to face her with expressions ranging from surprise to annoyance. Tyrvex lowered his hand slowly, and that cruel smile spread across his face once more. "Well, well," he said, "the Deathworlder has come to visit. And how did you find us down here, little human?" "Let him go," Kira said. And her voice was calm and steady, the voice of someone who had already decided what was going to happen. "Oh, what?" Tyrvex laughed, and his companions joined in. "You are one small creature against 5 of us, and your species is barely civilized enough to use utensils. I am giving you one chance to walk away," Kira continued, ignoring the insult. "Take it." The laughter grew louder, and one of the other Valorians stepped forward with a sneer on his angular face. "She thinks she is threatening us," he said to Tyrvex. "The primitive thinks she is scary. I think," Tyrvex replied, "that we have found ourselves another toy to play with." He looked at Kira with cold, hungry eyes, and she saw the moment he decided to hurt her. "You do not give us chances." "Ape," he snarled, "we give you chances. And your chance just ran out." He lunged at her, his hand reaching for her throat with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced real resistance. Kira did not flinch. She did not run. She simply moved, Her body shifted to the side at the last moment, and her hand closed around Tyrvex's wrist, and she pulled him forward using his own momentum against him. He stumbled past her, off balance and confused, and Kira spun and drove her elbow into the back of his head with enough force to send him crashing to the floor. The other Valorians stared in shock, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. "Your friend was right about one thing," Kira said softly, and her eyes moved from face to face, burning with something that made them all take a step back. "I am from a Deathworld." Reynold watched from his knees, his fading bioluminescence flickering with confusion and the smallest spark of something that might have been hope. He had never seen a human fight before, and he had certainly never seen anyone stand up to Tyrvex Shao. "What are you waiting for?" Tyrvex groaned from the floor, clutching his head. "Get her!" The 4 remaining Valorians exchanged glances, and then they charged. Kira took a breath and felt the fear wash away like water off stone, because fear was useful only until the fight began, and then it became a distraction. She was not afraid. She was ready. Her body had been shaped by a world that wanted to kill her, forged by gravity and predators and 10,000 generations of survival. The Valorians had been shaped by paradise, by a world where everything was soft and easy and safe. They did not know what they were facing. They were about to learn. The first one reached her with his fist raised, and Kira stepped inside his guard and broke his arm before he could complete the swing. His scream echoed through the cargo bay, and Kira was already moving, her elbow finding the throat of the second attacker and sending him stumbling backward, gasping for air. The third one tried to grab her from behind, and she drove her head backward into his face, feeling the crunch of breaking bone. The fourth hesitated, his eyes wide with terror, and that hesitation was all Kira needed. She closed the distance between them in a heartbeat and swept his legs out from under him, and he hit the ground hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs. 4 Valorians lay groaning and broken on the floor, and Kira had not even raised her heart rate. She turned to face Tyrvex, who had managed to climb to his feet and was now backing away with pure animal fear in his eyes. "Stay away from me," he stammered, and his voice had lost all of its cruelty, all of its confidence. Kira walked toward him slowly, and with each step she took, he retreated another pace until his back hit the wall and there was nowhere left to run. She grabbed him by the collar and pulled him close, and her face was inches from his, and her eyes were the eyes of a predator. "On my world," she whispered, "creatures like you get eaten." He whimpered, and the sound was pathetic. "You are not a predator, Tyrvex," Kira continued. "You have never been a predator. You are just loud." She released him, and he slid down the wall to sit on the floor, shaking. "Touch him again," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the silent cargo bay. "Touch anyone again, and I will not stop next time." Then she turned her back on him, dismissing him completely, and walked to where Reynold still knelt on the cold metal floor. She dropped to her knees in front of him, and her hands were gentle now, so gentle, as she tilted his chin up to look at his face. "Can you walk?" she asked softly. Reynold stared at her with wide eyes, and his bioluminescence was slowly returning, spreading across his skin in waves of blue light. "You came," he whispered, and his voice was filled with wonder. "I will always come," Kira replied, and she helped him to his feet with careful hands. That is what packmates do. Behind them, Tyrvex watched with hatred burning in his eyes. But he did not move and he did not speak, because for the first time in his privileged life, he had met something more dangerous than himself. And he was afraid. Kira guided Reynold through the dark corridors of the lower levels, her arm around his thin shoulders and her eyes constantly scanning for threats. He leaned against her heavily, his body weak from hours of abuse, but his bioluminescence was growing stronger with each step as hope replaced despair. "How did you do that?" he asked quietly. his voice still rough from his earlier screams. There were 5 of them. There were 5 of them, Kira agreed. But they were not prepared for what I am. And what are you? Kira considered the question as they walked. And when she answered, her voice was soft and thoughtful. I am human, she said, and my species was forged in fire. She told him about Earth as they made their way back to the upper levels, about a world that seemed determined to kill everything that lived on it. She told him about the gravity that crushed and strengthened, about the oxygen-rich atmosphere that fueled relentless metabolisms, about the predators that hunted in every environment from frozen tundra to boiling jungle. She told him about persistence hunting, the ancient technique where humans would chase their prey for hours and hours, until the animal simply collapsed from exhaustion, because no creature in the galaxy could match human endurance. She told him about the diseases and the parasites, the earthquakes and the volcanoes, the ice ages and the droughts that should have wiped humanity out 1,000 times over. But we survived, she said. We always survive, because that is what we do. Reynold listened in silence, and when she finished, he looked at her with new eyes. The galaxy calls your world a Deathworld, he said slowly. And they mean it as an insult. They do. But it is not an insult at all, is it? Kira smiled. And in that smile was 10,000 generations of survivors who had refused to die. No, she agreed. It is not. They reached the medical bay, and Kira helped Reynold onto an examination table before stepping back to let the automated systems scan his injuries. The damage was extensive, but not permanent. Bruises and minor cuts, and the kind of psychological trauma that would take time to heal. The system recommends rest and monitoring, the medical AI announced in its flat, synthetic voice. He will stay here tonight, Kira said, and I will stay with him. She pulled a chair close to the examination table and sat down, and Reynold watched her with a strange expression on his face. You could get in trouble for what you did, he said. Tyrvex will report you. He might. His family has power. Real power, and they could destroy your career. Kira shrugged. And the motion was casual in a way that made Reynold blink with surprise. Let them try, she said simply. Why? He asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. Why would you risk everything for someone like me? I am nobody. I have no power. I cannot give you anything in return. Kira leaned forward and took his hand in hers, and her grip was warm and strong. On Earth, she said, we have a saying, and it goes like this. The measure of a person is not what they do for those who can help them, but what they do for those who cannot. Reynold's bioluminescence pulsed with emotion, and Kira could see moisture gathering in his large dark eyes. I have never met anyone like you, he whispered. You have now, Kira replied with a gentle smile, and I am not going anywhere. They sat together in silence as the station's artificial night deepened, and eventually Reynold drifted into an exhausted sleep while Kira kept watch beside him. She did not sleep that night, and she did not need to, because humans could go for days without rest when necessary, another gift from their brutal homeworld. Instead, she thought about what would happen next, because Tyrvex would not let this stand, and his pride would demand some form of revenge. But Kira was not worried. She had learned something important during the fight in the cargo bay, something that changed everything. The Valorians were not warriors, not really, and they were predators in the same way that a house cat was a predator, dangerous only to things smaller and weaker than themselves. They had never faced a species that fought back, never encountered prey that was actually predator, never known what it felt like to be hunted instead of hunting. Kira had shown them that fear tonight, and fear was a powerful teacher. More importantly, she had Tyrvex's recording device, which she had picked up from the floor during the chaos of the fight. She had not mentioned it to Reynold yet, but that little piece of technology contained hours of footage, evidence of crimes that even the Valorian Dominion could not ignore. Tyrvex had made himself vulnerable by recording his cruelty, and now that vulnerability belonged to Kira. She turned the device over in her hands and smiled a cold smile. On Earth, humans had learned that the best defense was not strength or speed or even intelligence. The best defense was leverage. Morning came, and with it came the consequences that Kira had expected. She was summoned to the commandant's office before breakfast, and she walked through the academy's corridors with her head held high and her face calm. The Valorian cadets she passed stared at her with expressions ranging from hatred to fear, and she met every gaze without flinching. Word had spread quickly, as word always did, and the story of what happened in the cargo bay had grown with each telling. By now, everyone knew that the human girl had defeated 5 Valorians in single combat, and everyone was watching to see what would happen next. The commandant was a Valorian himself, an aging admiral named Shalver, who had earned his position through decades of political maneuvering. He looked at Kira with cold contempt as she stood before his desk, and she could see the prepared speech forming behind his eyes. "Cadet Vance," he began, "you have been accused of—" "Sir," Kira interrupted, and her voice was respectful but firm, "before you continue, I believe you should see this." She placed Tyrvex's recording device on his desk and activated the playback function. The commandant's face changed as he watched the footage, shifting from contempt to discomfort to something that might have been horror. He saw Reynold on his knees, begging for mercy. He saw Tyrvex laughing and striking and demanding more. He heard Tyrvex bragging about previous victims, naming names and dates and injuries. When the footage ended, the commandant sat in silence for a long moment, and Kira waited patiently. "This footage," he said finally. "Where did it come from?" "Tyrvex recorded it himself," Kira replied. He was quite proud of his work. The commandant's jaw tightened, and she could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. If this footage became public, it would be a scandal that the Valorian Dominion could not survive. Noble families would be disgraced, funding would be questioned, and the Academy's reputation would be destroyed. But if it stayed private, then everything could be handled quietly, and certain adjustments could be made. "I see," the commandant said slowly. "And what do you want, Cadet Vance?" Kira smiled, and it was the smile of a hunter who had cornered her prey. "Justice," she said simply. "Nothing more and nothing less." The commandant stared at her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. "You are dismissed," he said, "and I believe you will find that certain cadets are no longer welcome at this academy." Kira saluted crisply and turned to leave, but at the door she paused and looked back. "Sir," she said, "I grew up on a Deathworld, and there is something that Deathworlds teach you." The commandant raised an eyebrow. "Never threaten a human," Kira said softly, "because we always know how to bite back." And then she was gone, leaving the commandant alone with the recording device and the ruins of several noble careers. 3 days after Kira's meeting with the commandant, Tyrek Shao was gone. The official announcement said that he had withdrawn from the academy for personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth, and the truth spread through the station like fire through dry grass. The Valorian noble's son had been expelled in disgrace, and 2 of his accomplices had been expelled with him, and the Dominion had quietly withdrawn all complaints to avoid a scandal that would have destroyed a dozen powerful families. The remaining Valorian cadets walked the corridors with their heads down now, and their silver skin seemed duller somehow, as if the light of their arrogance had been extinguished. They did not look at Kira when she passed them, and they certainly did not speak to her, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Reynold recovered slowly from his ordeal, his body healing faster than his mind, but each day brought new strength and new hope. He returned to his studies with renewed determination, and his brilliance in xenobiology began to shine even brighter than before, because he no longer had to dim himself to avoid attention. 1 week after the incident, he approached Kira in the mess hall with a nervous expression and a small wrapped package in his hands. "This is for you," he said softly. "A gift from my family's homeworld." Kira unwrapped the package carefully and found a small crystal that glowed with the same soft blue light as Reynold's bioluminescence. "It is a memory stone," Reynold explained. "My people give them to those who have earned a place in their hearts. And you have earned a place in mine." Kira felt warmth spread through her chest, and she closed her fingers around the crystal gently. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "I will treasure it always." Reynold smiled, and it was a real smile this time, not the nervous, forced expression she had grown used to seeing. "You saved me," he said, "but more than that, you showed me that I do not have to be afraid." "You were never weak," Kira told him firmly. "You were surrounded by predators, and you survived. And that takes a different kind of strength." They sat together and ate their breakfast, and Kira noticed that other cadets were watching them from across the mess hall. Not Valorians, but the others, the prey species and the low-status species and all the forgotten ones, who had learned to keep their heads down and their voices quiet. They were watching Kira with something that looked like wonder, and they were watching Reynold with something that looked like hope. Over the following weeks, things began to change at the academy. It started small, with a timid Phileth cadet asking if she could sit with Kira and Reynold at meals. Then a pair of Kethra cadets from a minor clan joined them. And then a quiet insectoid species whose name Kira could not pronounce. And then more and more until their table in the mess hall had become a gathering place for misfits. They were not a formal organization, just a loose collection of cadets who had been overlooked and underestimated. But together they formed something that felt like family. Kira taught them what she could, not combat techniques, but something more important, the knowledge that they did not have to accept cruelty as the price of survival. "You do not have to be the strongest," she told them during one of their informal gatherings. "You just have to refuse to kneel." The words spread through the academy's underworld like a whisper, and Kira began to notice changes in the way people carried themselves. Prey species walked with their heads a little higher. Low-status cadets spoke a little louder in class. And the predator species, the ones who had grown comfortable at the top of the hierarchy, began to realize that the rules were changing. Instructor Morath found Kira after training one evening, and his scarred face wore an expression she had never seen before. "You have caused quite a disturbance," he said, but his voice was not angry. "The Commandant has received complaints from several noble families about the atmosphere at the academy." "I am sorry to hear that," Kira replied, though her voice made it clear she was not sorry at all. Morath studied her for a long moment, and then he did something that shocked her completely. He made a gesture with all four of his arms, a complex motion that Kira recognized from her cultural studies as the highest form of respect in Kethra society. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "I told you not to make enemies you could not fight. And instead, you taught me that some enemies need to be fought regardless of the odds. I learned that lesson on Earth," Kira said softly. "Where giving up means dying," Morath nodded slowly. And when he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "Perhaps the galaxy has forgotten what it means to come from a world like yours," he said. "Perhaps we have been comfortable for too long." "Perhaps," Kira agreed. "I will be watching your career with great interest," Morath continued, "and I suspect I am not the only one." He walked away, and Kira watched him go with a small smile on her face. Months passed, and the academy year drew toward its close, and Kira's squad had become something remarkable. They were not the strongest or the fastest or the most politically connected, but they worked together with a unity that other squads could not match. Reynold had become a leader in his own way, using his gentle nature and brilliant mind to solve problems that raw strength could not touch. The timid Phileth who had first asked to sit with them had found her voice, and now spoke up in tactical discussions with insights that impressed even the instructors. The Kethra pair had discovered that their minor clan's fighting techniques, long dismissed as primitive, were actually devastatingly effective when combined with human adaptability. They were a pack, and the pack was strong. On the final day of the term, Kira sat in the mess hall surrounded by her strange family, and she watched the other cadets moving around them. A group of Valorian cadets glanced in their direction as they passed, and Kira caught their eyes and held them. They looked away quickly and hurried on their way, and Kira smiled. "You are doing it again," Reynold said from beside her, his bioluminescence bright with amusement. "Doing what? That thing where you stare at people and they suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere?" Kira laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. "I cannot help it," she said. "It is a Deathworld thing." Around the table, her packmates laughed with her, and Kira felt a contentment that she had not known since leaving Earth. She had come to the academy, expecting to be alone, expecting to fight for survival in a galaxy that did not want her. Instead, she had found something precious, something worth protecting, something that made all the struggles worthwhile. She had found her people, and heaven help anyone who tried to hurt them, because Kira Vance was a daughter of Earth, and Earth did not raise its children to forgive. Later that evening, as the station's artificial sun dimmed toward night, Kira stood at the observation window where her journey had begun. The star spun slowly past her reflection, beautiful and cold and eternal, and she pressed her hand against the glass. Somewhere out there was Earth, a tiny blue marble that the galaxy called a Deathworld, and Kira smiled at the thought. Let them call it that. Let them underestimate humanity. Let them think that humans were primitives and barbarians and dangerous animals. Because one day, the galaxy would learn the truth that Tyrek Shal had learned in a forgotten cargo bay. Humans were not dangerous because they were violent. Humans were dangerous because they cared. And there was nothing in the universe more terrifying than a human who had found something worth fighting for. Reynold appeared beside her, his bioluminescence casting gentle blue light across the window. "Ready for next term?" he asked. Kira turned to look at him, at her friend, her packmate, her family, and she felt the crystal memory stone warm against her chest where it hung on a simple chain. "Ready," she confirmed. Together they watched the stars spin, a Phalef and a human standing side by side, and the future stretched before them like an open road. Whatever came next, they would face it together, because that was what packmates did. And the pack was strong,